Welcome. This is Tim Opsitnik. I am the Executive Vice President and General Counsel of TCDI, and I'm here with my guest speaker today, Matt Hostacki, who is the Regional Sales Manager for FlexIP Solutions. Matt has been in the telecommunications industry for 5 years with experience with both hardware and software platforms that are associated with voice over IP. This experience and knowledge gives Matt a very unique perspective of security and performance when it comes to unified communication. I've been involved in cybersecurity and electronic discovery for over 30 years, and I've served as a special master and an expert witness. And so today's presentation is going to be on voice and data security and communications. And I would like to encourage questions. So if anybody has any questions, you can type those into the chat, and Matt and I will do our best to respond. So what are we going to cover here today? So first thing is a lot about voice over IP security. It's not something that we hear a lot about today, so I think it's an important topic, something which doesn't seem to have a lot of focus on. We're also going to talk a little bit about the compliance and applicable telecommunication laws. And some of these are very recent, which makes them even more prescient for a discussion today. Next, we're going to talk about cybersecurity threats. What are we seeing out there? What's active right now? And what you need to be aware of. And lastly, look, what is practicing reasonable security? What does it look like? What's it all about? So Matt, are hackers really using packet sniffing technology? And is this something we should worry about with respect to voice over IP?
Yes, thank you, Tim. Appreciate you having me in today. And believe it or not, this is something that is happening. So think of packet sniffing as yesterday's wiretap. So if you've ever watched one of those old detective shows where they, would get a wiretap so they can listen in on the bad guys and what they were doing, this is pretty similar, except it's reverse. It's bad guys listening in or looking in on your packets that are leaving and incoming to your business. And yes, they can listen to your VoIP calls. Encryption is a good way to combat this. So not all VoIP services are encrypted, which obviously doesn't make them equal. So, it's very important to ask your provider, do you have, end-to-end encryption with your VoIP service so that this does not go on?
So Matt, we talk a lot about password security in the industry, and it seems to me that people don't necessarily take the same level of rigor with their password security when it comes to voice over IP. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, certainly. So I probably should have started off by just making a statement and kind of seeing where some folks, fall on this issue. If I tell you that your VoIP phone or SIP phone, session initiation protocol, that's what that stands for, is basically another endpoint on your network, I'm guessing that, somewhere around 50% are like, yeah, duh, of course it is. It's, it's getting an IP address. And then others are like, well, I never really thought of my phone as a security risk and things like that. And that's kind of why VoIP security is something that needs to be considered. And leading into that, passwords, if you look at your VoIP phone the same way you look at your workstation or your laptop, you wouldn't leave your laptop open for anybody to gain access to, right? And in the same regard, you don't want your VoIP phone just to have the typical manufacturer credentials in it. You can Google that and find it pretty common and pretty easy. So if you go into the advanced settings and you put in the default password, if you can get in there, you need to have a conversation with your telecommunications provider because that is definitely a risk out there. Furthermore, if your employees can access that, I'm sure most employees, they don't mean any harm, but it's the same reason why you wouldn't give them access to some of the network credentials and settings in your business network. So you want to kind of close off employees to some of the settings that are inside your phone because it does contain network configurations and that can compromise security.
So Katie, I think we've got a poll coming up here, which is a good follow-up on what Matt raised. And so let's ask our audience, how many of our attendees knew that voice over IP system could be a point of security of failure? All right, I think do we have the results? So 100% of our attendees knew, so that's awesome. That's very good. So let's go to the next slide. One of the things when I looked at this slide, I really was focusing on the second point here. Do your phones peer up to a voice firewall that sits behind a public IP address? So, I want you to make sure you explain to me what that means when you're covering this particular slide.
Certainly. So most businesses have a firewall, at least I hope you do. Otherwise, obviously, that's going to be a pretty big issue. But not all firewalls are created equal, meaning does it have specific voice settings? Does it offer quality of service? The way FlexIP does our implementations, our phones actually peer up to the firewall, and the firewall through something called option 66 points our phones back to our switch that sits in our NOC. And this is just another added layer of security. And there's different things, like I said, there's the QoS that goes into it too. So if you just have a data firewall, it might not be providing the same level of security and quality that a typical voice firewall can provide. And the first bullet point there is your provider separating voice and data. This is important for a couple different reasons. Now, typically this is done through VLANs. You could have a second physical network, meaning a second network cable can be run to your VoIP phone. That's not always feasible. It can be very costly to have a second cable run. So the more efficient way to do this is to create VLANs. And a couple things about the VLANs, if you're doing a tagged network with phones on a VLAN, now you can start troubleshooting. You can also pinpoint and isolate different issues, whether they're security or their quality of service. And this is pretty common out there, but we still see providers today that they do things, we call it plug and pray, where they literally just throw phones on the network and they'll go out to the wide world and then get their credentials. And there's obviously some risk associated with that.
I'm just chuckling at the plug and pray comment. So why does it matter that a phone authenticates to the voice IP server? Why is that important, Matt?
So it actually ties back to the plug and pray type of thing. Most providers out there, especially the over-the-top providers, they'll send you phones in a box and say plug them in, they'll do their thing, and they'll kind of phone home. It's a bad ET pun, but that's basically what they're doing, is they're looking for their switch back in their NOC. And if this can happen at any time, the way I kind of explain it is, imagine if your business doors were open 24/7, but you weren't a 24/7 type of business. So obviously you can let anybody in at any time, and there's inherent risk to that. Where if there's a specific authentication time, typically what happens in our implementations are we set it for anywhere between 6 hours to maybe 24 hours, depending on what the circumstance calls for. Basically, if we turn on a phone and it's past that authentication time, it's going to hit our server and it's just going to keep getting denied. Where if it's open all the time, if somebody gains access to credentials, they are now able to plug a phone in anywhere in the world, and it'll phone home to your system switch, and then they can start dialing out and making calls and doing all these other things, potentially racking up huge 800 or 900 number charges. So this is why it's very important to kind of limit this authentication time, so you can't just throw phones on a network at any point in time and then they light up. It just helps mitigate some of that risk.
So, Matt, what type of fraud detection applications or services are available today for voice over IP, and how do they work?
That's a great question. So there's typically active and passive. Passive, honestly, it's almost pointless. If a company offers that, they're not doing too much. It's obviously not active. It's in the name, it's passive. So it's going to take a whole lot of activity and a whole lot of things going on for anybody to figure out that something's going on. What you want to look for, and not all providers have this, you want active. They need to set certain thresholds for calls. So if somebody were to hijack your phone and start dialing out, set a call limit. Is it 40 calls an hour or 100 calls an hour? So many calls per day? Are they blacklisted and whitelisted places? Because a lot of times they'll take the numbers and they'll start calling over to Eastern Europe or calling from Eastern Europe. So some of these other countries might need to be blacklisted. That's the type of conversation that you need to have with your telecommunications provider to help protect you against these gigantic charges that do and have happened.
Great. So let's talk a little bit about compliance and applicable telecommunication laws. Matt, I know you have a couple here today that you really want to focus on. Could we talk a little bit about those and what you need to consider when you're installing or choosing a VoIP system?
Certainly. So there's two pieces of legislation that were enacted in January of 2020. They were passed prior to that, but they went into effect in January. Now they work together, though they are separate acts. Now Carrie's Law stemmed from an unfortunate incident with a woman named Carrie who tried to dial out from, I believe it was a hotel. And by the time emergency services were able to locate her, she unfortunately passed away from whatever the emergency was. Now, there's two statutes that go into Carrie's Law. The first being they want to eliminate any prefix dialing. So if you were part of an organization or if you remember systems where, hey, do I need to dial a 9 to grab an outside line? That's what they're trying to prevent, specifically for 911 dialing. So, and this is only for new implementation. So if you have a system and it was implemented prior to January of 2020, you do not need to worry about this just yet. This is for all new implementations, but you should just be able to pick up a phone, dial 911 and get out. The second statute is of equal importance, and this is a notification must be sent to on-site personnel. That way, especially if you're in a school setting, if you're in a hotel setting, a resort, hospital, big campus, if somebody dials 911, somebody else should know about it, right? That way help can get to that person. So now a notification can come in the form of another phone call, a text, or an email. And typically a person or persons are designated to receive these notifications. So in effect, that's pretty much Carrie's Law. So very much like Carrie's, this went into effect in early January. It's only for new implementations. So anything that was prior to this, you don't necessarily have to be concerned with. Pretty much what Raybaum's Act has to deal with, if you use what they call a soft phone, if you're getting your phone calls on an app on your phone, not your cell phone number, but if your company line is tied to an app on your phone or using a soft client on your laptop, that's what this is referring to. And basically what they want is wherever you're at, it needs to identify your location when you call out. And it's tricky in this regard. Typically when 911 or E911 is set up, there's some lines of data that go in, and it's typically an address, possibly a username. It could be like a floor or even a room. So the best way to think about this is imagine if you're working at Panera. A lot of folks would like to go to Panera, Starbucks, or whatever. You're using the Wi-Fi and you're kind of working there sipping coffee, pre-COVID, of course. Well, if you were to dial 911 from there previously, it would use whatever they have on file. So if your address was somewhere in Cleveland, Ohio, but you're on the west side in a suburb and you're sitting in a Starbucks somewhere, the emergency personnel would go to Cleveland. This act and piece of legislation is geared around removing that obstacle and putting it to more accurate location. Now, one thing to understand with this is that it is still a work in progress because there's some technology that needs to kind of catch up to enable you to make a call from a VoIP app and have that information go out to the local 911 call center.
So we're going to talk a little bit about cybersecurity threats at this point, but before we do that, I'm sure we're going to have great results from this poll, but how many of our attendees have been or know of a company that's been affected by an incident or a data breach? So we'll give it a second and see what the results are. So it's about 50-50. So that's pretty substantial. One of the first things we're going to talk a little bit about are malware. I'm going to just identify a few types of malware. We've heard a lot of these phrases, and then we're going to talk in some detail about individual pieces of malware. But we've got viruses and Trojans and bots and keyloggers and spyware and adware and ransomware. So malware is significant.
So Tim, malware is obviously a huge issue, but how have cyber criminals been capitalizing on the recent transition to remote work due to COVID?
So some of the more recent studies report that there's been substantial increases. We've got a citation here that things have increased about 260% in the most recent quarter. And I will tell you that it just continues to accelerate. There are people out there who are taking advantage of the pandemic, and both people who do this from the standpoint of nation states who are trying to steal intellectual property, especially healthcare related information that might relate to medicines that are going to help people with this, as well as patient results and vaccine information. Companies are being besieged by nation states attempting to steal this information from those healthcare companies. In addition, small businesses and other businesses, probably everybody on this call has been affected by receiving all sorts of emails, and you should immediately be alert the moment you see anything about COVID in the email, offering you cheap prices on masks or the latest technology or the latest news. All these things really should heighten your level of security. So let's talk about ransomware a bit, because ransomware is the one additional malware that really seems to have accelerated. Probably everybody out there knows what ransomware is, but you're affected either by malware that you receive through email or you get by surfing the internet, and it accesses your computer system and goes through a process where it uploads a payload, and that payload starts to search for and identify and encrypt your valuable information. And once that encryption stops, it sends you a message and says, hey, if you want your data back, pay this ransom. Ransomware continues to proliferate. It's a huge problem for businesses. It seems the cost for ransoms continue to go up and up and up. Let's talk about phishing. I think everybody is aware as to what phishing is. Phishing are emails which contain certain types of malware, and the perpetrators behind this try to trick you into clicking on executables or giving up sensitive information. And so we just need to be very cautious about phishing. It's accelerated significantly, all forms of disorder in cybersecurity. So the next type is the business email compromise. What is a business email compromise? It's typically somebody seeking for you to send them dollars in some fashion, but they typically target CFOs or other people in financial positions in companies and attempt to get them to change the account information and other things to send dollars where they weren't supposed to go. And this has been a huge problem recently, and it continues to accelerate. And anytime you get an email that says our account number has changed, please send our money for our invoices from now on to this date, the hair on the back of your neck should go up, and you should immediately call and say, hey, did you send me this? Is this really coming from you? And provide a great deal of scrutiny to these requests. So supply chain attacks are something which have accelerated in the last few years. I can't say as though we've seen as much acceleration in the last quarter or 6 months as we have in some of the other types of malware, but in the past several years, it certainly has picked up. And what supply chain attacks really are third parties who you entrust access to your network in some fashion. They are vulnerable, and somebody gets access to their network, and once they get access to their network, they then get access into your network and then attempt to do things in your network, such as inject malicious code, for example, copy credit card information or the like. So supply chain attacks have really increased in the past few years. So just go ahead, Matt.
Well, I was just going to say, what can organizations do to minimize their risk against these types of attacks?
Well, look, you've got to hold third parties who you give access to your network to be accountable. They have to have the same level of scrutiny as you have. I mean, you've got to make sure that they are doing what you're doing and that they're doing the same level of assessments and the same scrutiny to their networks and systems that you're doing. So it's essential that, they take this very seriously as well. And so when you're engaging with a third party who you're going to entrust this information to, it's a trusted relationship, and you really got to look at what they're doing and how they're doing it to make sure that they're doing it in a manner consistent with the way that you do it. So I'm going to just briefly talk about, some of the impacts of cybersecurity incidents. Most of these are pretty obvious, but obviously loss of valuable information, direct financial loss, unfavorable media exposure, damage to reputation, outages and disruption to business, regulatory audits and fines, civil lawsuits, criminal charges. A couple things to focus on. One are contractual obligations. A lot of organizations don't realize that they enter into contractual arrangements with third parties when they sign agreements that say they're going to do X, Y, or Z as it relates to security. So you really have to be cognizant about what you're signing in your agreements. And I like to encourage clients to say, you need to do a great job with respect to cybersecurity because it makes you look more competitive than others in your industry out there. Let's talk a little bit about practicing reasonable security. What does that look like? When determining what you want to do, the first thing you need to do is you need to look at your level of maturity, both in terms of where you're at, but also where you want to go. And, if you're a defense contractor or a healthcare company, a hospital, you may well need to be leading or certainly optimizing. But, if you're just the typical small business, practicing may be just fine. So you've got to have a framework for having a discussion about this in terms of, hey, this is where we are right now. We're very informal. We seem to be reactive. We haven't taken any affirmative steps to evaluate improvements. So we're somewhere between ad hoc and developing. But then, hey, what's right for us? Where do we need to be moving forward? And what does that look like? And so the next series of slides that we're going to go over really are the types of things that every organization should have at some proportional level. And proportionality is a consideration for all of these things. But I'm going to go through 10 cybersecurity controls that every organization should be doing at some level. So when you go back and you talk to your IT staff, or you talk to your third-party managed services provider, or you talk to vendors, these are the sorts of questions that you ought to be asking them. Now, everybody's different and everybody may need more or less of something, but all 10 of these things at some level ought to be included in an organization today. So
Hey,
the first,
Tim,
yep, sure.
I've seen assessment mean different things, from evaluating compliance to vulnerability scanning. How can organizations tell the difference between what they need and what vendors are offering?
Yeah, so the words are used interchangeably, unfortunately, which causes great confusion. And so typically when somebody says that they do cybersecurity assessments, I ask, well, what does that mean? What is it that you actually do? And so I'm going to talk a little bit today about different types of assessments. And, the first type of cybersecurity assessment, which is something that, we, TCDI, does, really it's a third-party assessment where you come in and you take a look at it. And from a very high level, it's what should you start doing and what should you stop doing? It's taking a look at your security controls and your compliance efforts and saying, those things are great. You need to keep doing those. And in fact, you need to do more of. Those things aren't very good. Stop doing them and let's find a different way. So that's a cybersecurity assessment. And so some of the confusion sometimes comes in because people often call penetration testing or some form of that. And the initial step in penetration testing is vulnerability scanning. And sometimes people call this an assessment or a technical assessment. but it really is penetration testing. And what that basically means is, okay, you've put all these great things in place, but are the doors really locked? Let's make sure the doors are locked and you're doing the things you say you do and they work the way you think they are. So what penetration testing is at its very first step is you do this automated vulnerability scanning. And again, that's where some of the confusion comes in, because the vulnerability scanning is an automated step done by a tool and doesn't really involve much human intervention, whereas true penetration testing begins with a vulnerability scan, but then starts to develop ways in which to attack the systems and using the information they've developed through, among other things, the automated scanning. And it tests to make sure things are the way they're supposed to be. And so the next thing that is an essential element are really some sort of active monitoring of the networks. For many organizations, it might simply be endpoint protection or virus protection, but it's actively monitoring to ensure that if something happens, if there's some sort of an incident, automated steps take place to notify, alerts go out, things get put in place to block it from happening. It detects anomalies real time. So at a minimum, it includes the endpoint protection, but it may include all sorts of other things, such as event monitoring and data loss prevention and things of that nature. So the next thing that every company should have is an incident response plan. Why is an incident response plan important? Well, in the event that you have an incident, and most organizations will have an incident at some point, you don't want to be developing the plan for how to fix things during the crisis. You want to have that plan in place beforehand, because my experience is you're often more judged by outsiders by the steps you take to respond to an incident than you are in the steps or your lack of controls or the controls you had in place which led to the incident. So it's important that you've got an incident response plan in place so you have people to prepare to help you remediate it and to do the investigation and determine how many people are affected, who's been affected, help to provide notice. And so incident response plan is an essential element of reasonable security.
Hey, Tim, how does an organization know what compliance regulations apply to them? I see we're coming up on the compliance requirements portion of this.
So yeah, every organization should know what compliance regulations they need to adhere to, because it determines what you as an industry need to do. And typically do that by engaging a privacy expert of some sort. They may well be your outside counsel, they may well be inside counsel, they may well be a security officer or a privacy officer in your company. But you've got to determine, what compliance regulations I'm obligated to follow. Because if you don't know what obligations you have from a compliance standpoint, how do you know what security controls are at issue? So training employees, look, it's been my experience that your employees tend to be your first and last line of defense. You need to train your employees at a minimum when you onboard them, but also on some regular period of time, whether it's annually or quarterly or monthly or even weekly. I know at our organization, we receive weekly tips that go out from our security officers telling us, hey, this is some things that you need to be aware of. This is happening in other organizations. So you have to have constant training in place to make sure your employees are doing what they need to do. And there are very cost-effective solutions at a lower cost, that are very good at doing this. A next item at some level you need to do is a data audit. What data do you have and where is that data sitting? Much like your voice over IP is a component of data, you need to know, hey, I have a voice over IP network. And I am receiving this sorts of data. Where might the security controls be in place for this and what should they be? And so it can be all kinds of information, but what data you have, where is it sitting, who has control over it, and then what compliance requirements apply to it. Account audits. You need to routinely do account audits. Determine, does somebody have the right level of privileges? Are their privileges too broad or too narrow? We often see that the companies will give wide administrative privileges to all of their staff, and then when a particular staff member has an incident or receives malware, now their privileges are then escalated throughout the organization. And so you need to do an account audit to make sure that people have no more privileges than necessary to do their job, but also that there's no accounts out there that are legacy accounts or orphan accounts that nobody knows who they are and what they're doing and who has control over it. Patching.
Hey,
Operating
Tim,
systems. Go ahead. Sure.
how can IT manage system patching with the increase in remote workers that may be using personal devices at home?
Yeah, so this is very, very difficult because we only have control of our own systems. And one of the things that we've seen and we recommend is that, of course, you patch your operating systems and your applications at regular intervals. And so as people have gone to work remotely, it has all of a sudden caused people to use their own home computers or taken off-site laptops that historically weren't used other places. And so it's created all kinds of unknowns for the typical organization. So most companies have responded very well to this. I've been amazed by what I've seen in terms of the preparation of this. But you got to create a plan and you've got to create a policy for your employees working at home that tell your employees, these things are appropriate and what's not appropriate, and give them training tips and other things to deal with these issues, including patching their own systems where applicable. So lastly, from a data continuity standpoint, you have to ensure that data is backed up. Incidents are inevitable, and it's not enough to know that the data is backed up, but also that it's tested from time to time. You need to know and be able to make sure that you can recover from a backup. And so you do the backups at regular intervals and you test the backups to know where you are. So these are the 10 tips that at some point, if you're practicing reasonable security, you should be doing some level of all of these things. Now, I know, Katie, we've asked for questions, and all right, I see a question here. Matt, what is the best way for a company to find out if your voice system is secure today?
That's a great question. So the first thing is, depending on if you're working with an outsourced telecommunication company or your IT company does it, you're going to want to start by making sure if you do use an outsourced IT company and a telecommunications company, are they working together? Because ultimately the data is still on the network. It's still data, right? You need to make sure that those companies are working together so that there's not conflict. The next thing is start asking some of the questions that we kind of went through at the beginning of the webinar. Are you separating voice and data? Do you have a voice firewall in place? Is your voice system, is it encrypted? Just different things like that can make a world of difference to find out if you're choosing the right VoIP provider.
So Matt, the next question that we have that relates to your topic is, am I out of compliance if I've installed my voice over IP system prior to 2020?
No, you are not out of compliance. Anything prior to January 2020, you still fall under the Carries Law and Ray-Balms Act. I will say, as an additional note with the Ray-Balms Act, like I said, the carriers are working on the technology to be able to locate individuals when they dial E911 in different locations as they travel around with their soft client or mobile application. So that still won't go into effect probably until 2022. They're basically giving them around 18 months to 2 years to try to get this in place. So even with Raybaum's Act, you still have a little bit of time. Just something to consider moving forward.
So Matt, one of the questions that's been posed is with respect to the two acts that you discussed, Raybaum's Act and the other, and that was, what type of regulations are those? Are those federal? Are they nationwide? Are those particular state regulations? What type of regulations are those?
That's also a great question. Depending on what state you live in, there are different regulations and fees and taxes and surcharges per state. These particular regulations are federal, so it affects everybody in the United States. So yeah, it doesn't matter where your business is located, you're going to have to follow these.
Okay, so one of the questions I have here is, when we're evaluating vendors for penetration testing, why is there such a disparity in prices? Why are some significantly cheaper than others? Well, remember when I talked a little bit about penetration testing, I talked about automated scanning activities. And so many organizations that are providing proposals on penetration testing are really only providing proposals for automated scanning and not true penetration testing. And that's the disparity of pricing. When they're using just the automated tools, some of which tend to be publicly available and not completely evaluated, they don't give the same level of scrutiny that other tools do, as well as don't do the manual part of the penetration testing. We've got 1 minute left, and I've got one last question here that I see, and it says, and it's a great question, frankly. I get asked it all the time. We are a small organization and don't really have compliance regulations outside of PCI. We still want to be secure, though. Is there a set of guidelines that we can follow that aren't overly complicated or expensive? This is really a great question. And what I tend to tell people is that the Center for Internet Security Access Controls are much more prescriptive than many of the other frameworks or any of the regulatory controls or regulatory foundations. And so the Center for Internet Security, it's much more like a list rather than a journey, which many of the other frameworks take you through a self-evaluation process, and they tell you, consider this and look at that, and what's that really going to look like. But the Center for Internet Security access controls are much more prescriptive. And so for most small organizations, that is a great place to start. Matt, I really appreciate you joining me today, and thanks so much. Any last thing to tell our attendees? We're on our final minute.
I just wanted to thank you, Tim, and TCDI for having me. I certainly appreciate it, and our attendees, thank you for attending. So I hope everybody has a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone. Enjoy your day.